Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Environmental Impact Assessments. In today's lecture, we are going to look at the EIA methods, particularly with the coastal zones, how you really do with the coastal areas. What kind of tools and techniques do you use? So accordingly, our coverage would include that we'll first look into definitions and concepts, and then we'll look at what kind of information is needed for coastal geomorphology, and how do you look at various habitat, and then how you work on the scoping part, and then what kind of data has to be collected for baseline study, the secondary data which is required, as well as what kind of surveys have to be undertaken related with geomorphological survey, ecological survey, and then how do you really undertake evaluation of the baseline conditions, what you have studied. So that is what we are going to cover. And the learning outcomes expected from you after completion of this session is that you should be able to define certain key concepts and items in this. And then you should be able to list various information that are needed in order to undertake coastal geomorphology and various habitat study. And then you should be able to review the purpose of scoping when you're dealing with coastal area. And then you should be able to identify various secondary data sources which will be required for you to undertake baseline study, as well as you should be able to identify and select among the surveys which are available for geomorphological survey and ecological surveys. And then you would know the basic concepts and the process of how you evaluate the baseline condition. So that is the expected learning outcome. So moving on to the definitions and concepts. So keeping in mind the key idea that coasts are among the most dynamic parts of the Earth's surface. So you see that their boundaries keep changing. They keep changing. They are going on transforming all the time, and then they change as the shoreline changes, and the shoreline changes almost every day with the tide, and you also see seasonal variations, and you also see variations in the geomorphology itself. And you see that the coastal landforms are shaped and reshaped even by the winds, waves, currents, and which in turn also vary through the time. Even the geomorphology also vary, and all these keep on constantly changing. So here you see the entire coastal area and all the terminologies here. So looking at the supralateral term. So supralateral is above the high tide mark and is usually not underwater. So you can see in the image that area shown in the arrow is the area we are talking about. And then you have lateral zone, which is the part of the coast that is exposed at whenever the water level is low, and it's submerged when your water level is high. So it's the intertidal zone, so which is the lateral zone you see here. The near shore sublateral zone is the coast seaward of the littoral zone, so it's on the seaward side to the water depth, where sediment is not disturbed during fair weather conditions. So there's no disturbance in the sediment there. So you see that in the image. the habitat and communities within all these three zones, what we are looking at, are influenced by the geology and geomorphological process in the area. So whatever happens, how's the geology, how is the process, all that habitat and communities vary with that, and it has a great influence. All these geology and geomorphological process has influence on that. So looking at the coastal geomorphology, so the coastal geomorphology is very important in EIA for two main reasons. So we see that geomorphological landforms and processes are very, like, they are part and parcel of the coastal ecosystem, and they have direct relevance to the risk of coastal erosion. So what the processes are, how the forms are, so they eventually influence the coastal erosions and flooding. So it has a very direct implication in EIA. So any kind of change in this would lead to direct and indirect impact, like since it has those relationship with the risk of the in the coastal area, so you would have erosions and all flooding, all this can happen here. So for EIA, if you look, you need two geomorphological information. That is, one is process and the other is the material. So for the process information, that includes you look at marine forcing factors which are present in the process, like what's the you look at the wind, waves, tides, tidal currents, and sea level change. And you also look at, like, their trends, in which direction they are going, and then how do they vary with time, how the variation is. So you look at all these processes. So it's important when you're undertaking EIA. So you look at these aspects of process while looking at EIA. So the other you see is, I said, the material information. And the important material information which you require for EIA purpose is the geology of the coastal zone, such as, like, you look at the how is the geology in the offshore, what's the geology onshore, how is the rock, how is the sediment, softer sediments, and so on. You look at the topography, you look at the profile of the land, like what all is there and what's the shape profile of that land. And then you look at the underwater topography, which is also called bathymetry. So you also look at that. And then you look at the types, like what type you have. You have mud, sand, gravel, and all. And then the distribution of mobile and non-mobile sediments, the sediments which are moving or they are stationary. So you need to have these kind of information. And it's important that you look at the interaction between the material and the processes at the interface, land and sea interface. So this would mean that you have to look at what kind of erosions are happening, what kind of sediment transports are happening, what kind of deposition is happening, and how it is happening across the area, like spatially, and how it is happening across at different time period, what kind of changes are happening, temporal changes are happening in these processes. So you need to look at these information. So while looking at the coastal geomorphology, the interaction between physical process, the wind, waves, tides, and tidal currents, they become very important, and they erode, they transport and deposit sediments to create landforms. So the understanding that is very important, and you need to review that alongshore sediment transport in EIA process. So how is the sediment transport is happening along the shore, and then what kind of net transport direction can be established, what is really happening, and that you can do through field survey field criteria, you need to take several parameters into consideration, and for that you can have buildup of you can take observations of buildup of sediments, which you can see cross shore structure and along shore growth of spits. We are going to see what spits means. So, but by the observation of the shoreline, you can also understand how the transportation and in which direction the transportation is happening. So that allows you to understand what's the real characteristic of this place. Further, you can also undertake like modeling, numerical modeling can also be done to understand how the sediment transportation is happening, and you have wide range of models available for the purpose. And process of sediment deposition lead to variety of coastal landforms, and then the most of which are, so looking at some of the landforms because of the sediment deposition, you can look at the beaches. You are familiar with beaches, so that's one of the landform. So you see that it's the accumulation of loose sand or shingles that change shape in response to changes in wave energy. So that's the beaches, and a beach is able to maintain itself in a state of like dynamic equilibrium with its environment due to the mobility of its sediment. So sediment is constantly moving, so that's why it's able to maintain the dynamic equilibrium. Now looking at spits. So spits is something when a coastline turns abruptly landward. So the coastline is not really looking towards the sea, but it's looking towards the land. So that is what is spits. And you can have various forms you can see in the picture. And generally spits are connected to the end of the attached beach by a narrow neck and are fed, and then they regularly get sediments eroded from other areas and gets the transport like as per the transportation system there. Then another term you can look at is dunes. So from where a supply of dry sand and wind to move it exists together. So you have dry sand and then the wind, they come together. So dune systems are usually fronted by sand beaches and sand bars exposed at the low tide. So that's the dunes, and their development and maintenance depends to a large extent on the vegetation, which allows a stabilization of the sand. So they are also important. Then you also have muddy shorelines, and you see the muddy shorelines are common along the upper level of intertidal zone of estuaries and sheltered tidal embayments. So you see that in the figure, and they form where tidal currents velocities are too weak to resuspend completely the mud that settles out at a higher water slag. So that's the muddy shorelines, you see that. And you see that in all of these, tide is the central feature and on which the habitats function. So further, you also see that you have salt marshes and mud flats also, which are also important for flood defense and all. And they are important because they dissipate wave and tidal energy. So they reduce those things. They reduce the wave and then they reduce the tidal energy. And when they reduce it, they also reduce the chances of erosion. So that is why they are important. And salt marshes and mud flats are said to have very high natural value, and they also support large population of invertebrates and birds. So it has a lot of significance. So all of these systems depend on the continuous supply of sediments. So how those sediments are coming and coming from the river, which discharge, or the coastal erosions and so on. So which can be interrupted by activities such as coastal protection works and dredging. So any kind of changes in the sediment supply can also cause downdrift effects. So downdrift effect is the impact on the lee side of the coastal activities, and it also causes downdrift erosion. So now looking at what kind of habitat really exists in all these three layers we talked about. So supralittoral habitat, so that's the image which we saw. So it's the level above the limit of the extreme high water spring tides, and this supralittoral zone supports a lot of terrestrial vegetation, and it's like mostly near littoral locations which are affected by wave, splash, and spray. So you would see the salt tolerant plant species, and they would often dominate the vegetation community. So because the waves are coming and then it's spraying that area, so there you would find that there are salt tolerant plants near those areas. So these supralittoral zone include several important habitats, including coastal cliffs and vegetated shingles. So you see them. And then the coastal cliffs and slopes, they also vary a lot in character. They show the local geology, landform, and many process ranging from vertical to gently sloping. So you would see all these in the coastal cliff, and these features support like lot of habitat, and you would find like rock crevasses and ledges, seepages, coastal grasslands, heathlands, and scrub and all. So there is a range of variety which you see in the coastal cliff. Then you have vegetated shingles. So you see the scrubby vegetation or grass sward, and in the exposed areas, you have open vegetation and scattered vascular plants and lichens, which you can see here. And if you note that this habitat is particularly sensitive to human disturbances, and if they are damaged once, it is said that recovery is very slow. So one has to avoid those damages there. And then you also find sand dunes, which typically consist of several dunes aligned approximately parallel to the coastline. And they are said to be very complex system, which include range of habitats that are sensitive to disturbance. So supralittoral habitats are usually like after that you have agricultural land or then developed land. You would find that, and like you would have various land use, industrial, residential, and so on. And if such kind of land use are not coming where human interference is there, then these habitats would grade inland into fully terrestrial habitats such as woodland. So if human interference is not there, then there are likely chances that you might have woodlands in this zone. So it might be it is said that it might be a little difficult to clearly define this area. So that's about the habitat in supralittoral area zone. And now you look at the littoral habitat. So littoral zone, as we had seen, it's a very narrow a narrow zone. So it's between the high tide and the low tide area. And you would see that you have steep shingle beaches, or you can also have mud flats. You will see that in most littoral habitats, whatever species are there which sustain in this particular zone, they are mostly marine in nature, and they are much more adapted to the cyclic system which is there in the marine cyclic system which is there. So they are very sensitive to that and adjusted to that. So the communities usually which exist here, they show like it's really how the entire area is working, so it aligns itself with that. So it is controlled by the kind of elevation it has, how high it is from the water level uh, compared to how far it is from the water level. So the depth makes a lot of difference to the littoral habitation. So you would be looking at various substrate characteristics, different pockets in this littoral habitats, and that will again depend on the geology, landform type, and what kind of exposure they have. And you would also see that usually the mud accumulates in many of the locations, and you would wherever the exposure is happening, you might find different kind of sediment deposition. You would also see rocky shores, which are also important, and they provided very impenetrable kind of zone. So you cannot really penetrate in that zone, and you see that very few organisms would be living there, but you would find that they support seaweeds, animals that are like really like to live in the rock surface. So this will also vary with the wave exposure and what kind of rock type is there. So with that also there will be variations. So you might be required to also look at different locations and then see that if the area is coming in the supralittoral zone or littoral zone. So you would be looking at the exposed coastline and headlines, and then you would find that there's rocky shores, or in the supralittoral zone you would have coastal cliff and slope. And then fairly exposed coastlines. So you would see that you have shingle beaches, and then in the supralittoral zone you have vegetated shingles. Then when you look at the exposed or fairly exposed coastlines in the bays or the mouth of the estuaries, you would find sandy shores, and then you would also see sand dunes and mud shares in supralittoral zone. Then you would also see estuaries and sheltered inlets, which in littoral zone would have mud flats and salt marshes. And then in the depression, partially cut off from seawater, you would have coastal lagoons. Tropical intertidal zone, you will find in the littoral zone, you will find mangrove forest. So now moving on to another sublittoral habitat. So this is the upper limit of the sublittoral zone, where you have extreme low water spring tide level, and the seaward limit is less clear. So where it really ends, it's not very clear. So you can see that you can include the shallow sea to the depth where sediment is not disturbed at all. So you can see where there's shallow sea to the deep sea. You can take that area as the sublittoral habitat. And you see that the environmental fluctuation is very less in this littoral zone. And the seabed is very soft in nature in this area. Looking at the substrata type of this habitat, sublittoral habitat. So, this largely controls the range and types of organisms which are present in the area. And there is a lot of differences in the salinity and turbidity in this particular area. And then there's also variation in the temperature and water clarity. You would also see a difference in topography and currents, light, and geothermal activity in this particular zone. So if you see that the ecosystem of this sublittoral and open sea will depend on the flow of energy, how the energy and nutrients are flowing, what's happening in the food chain, based on all the kind of activities and the processes which are going on there. So we'll not get into the details of that. So one needs to understand that these kind of variations are there, and how do they really vary across, and how the habitat would vary, how the processes would vary. So that understanding is needed. So moving on to the scoping and baseline studies. So while you're doing scoping, so here you need to see that there are certain key issues which you need to consider in the scoping stage when you're dealing with the coastal area. So first you would identify the impact area. So you would look at to what extent the impact of any development what you're doing will happen, and impact in terms of the marine ecology you're going to look at. What kind of habitat, what kind of species which are there. And then you would look at not only the area, but you will also look at the impacts. What kind of impacts are happening, what potentially significant impacts would happen, and because of that, what indications you're getting in the scoping stage, so that you might have to take a later detailed study with respect to that. And then at the scoping stage, you would also decide time of survey, like when you're going to undertake this survey, depending on what kind of impact would be there, what kind of area you have to cover. So you also need to decide the time of survey, and in which season you would do, and what frequency you would do. Further, you would also see that whatever is the existing data which is available, the secondary data which is available, is that sufficient or not, and whether you'll be able to determine any kind or draw any kind of conclusion from there. And that would also help you to understand what kind of detailed study has to be taken. And in this stage itself, you need to also decide what kind of modeling study you would do if it is required. So the modeling study for the coastal area can be very complex, very expensive, and it can be time consuming as well. And then you also need to see what kind of methods you will be using for looking at the magnitude and significance of the impacts which will happen. When you look at the secondary data, so what kind of secondary data you would require. So most of the existing information, you would see that now the aerial photography is most used, satellite data is more used, because you see that the coastal areas are wide and complex, and it's not easy to have very point data in most of the places. So we are seeing that more and more use of aerial photography and satellite data is increasing. And you also need to have topographic maps, and also bathymetric charts have to be prepared. So all of these provide key information on the current and the historic morphology of the coast, and then they allow you to identify what's really happening, so you can really see what kind of trend is happening and what you can project and predict. So here in this snip what I have taken from a study, you can see what kind of data they have used. So you can see the shoreline change rate. They have used data used as Landsat, and sea level change rate, coastal slope, and significant wave height, tidal range, coastal regional elevation, and all that. You can see SRTM data, IRS-P6, list 4 data, and then you have tsunami run-up, which is numerical model which they have used, and then the resolution and the period for which that have done. So I've given you the link from where you can download this study which is there. Further, through the manual of the shipbreaking yard, I have taken like what could be the possible source of data. So I have not taken all of that, but you can see some of these here. So you have Central Institute of brackish water aquaculture. So they have they keep repository of information on brackish water fishery, agriculture research information system. They have socioeconomic environmental impact and guidelines. All these you can get. Then you have Central Marine Fisheries Research Institution, which again keeps data. Then you have Central Water and Power Research Station. They also maintain data. Then you have Department of Ocean Development. So you can see range of data which they keep. You have environmental parameters, living resources, then stock assessment, investigations of toxical algal blooms, and coastal ocean monitoring and prediction system. All these you can use a lot of secondary data which has been constantly monitored. You also have National Institute of Ocean Technology. You have National Institute of oceanography. So all these are available in the Indian scenario, where you can collect data for your further analysis and baseline study. Further, you would be required, if only it is required, so you can undertake geomorphological survey. But it is advisable that these are very expensive and tedious, time consuming. So one should really go for secondary data and only undertake primary survey only if it is required, and if your project is large enough to allow you that kind of time and investment. So looking at what kind of geomorphological surveys are undertaken. So you can review all the geomorphological parameters in different kinds of methods, and some of the methods are like you can have in the site itself, you can have certain recording instruments, or you can also have remote sensing techniques. So those can be used here. So you undertake geomorphological monitoring only if required. So when you take it, what all things you really record. So you take tidal current meter and wave station is used, where you monitor that. You have sediment samplings, what can you do, you can undertake, and with that also bathymetric and topographic surveys can be done. And then you also have laser induced directions and range LiDAR measurement of distance using laser, and then you also have aerial photography which can be used. So in this image you can see tidal current meter and wave station. I'm also giving you the link. Then you can also see how sediment sampling can be done. So these are the manuals and guidelines which are available. I'm not going to get into the details of it. So these guidelines, the links I have provided to you. Then this is the snip I am showing about the laser-induced direction range LiDAR, how it measures the distances, then how you can use aerial photography. So the data from waves, tides and currents are usually taken from direct measurement. Like you can use wave recorders, you can have tide gauge and current meters also. And however, you can get all these data, but main problem is that when you use the specific site specific data, it's the problem that how much you can really generalize these things for the larger area. So that challenge remains. Looking at the wave data recording and processing techniques, so there are certain methods for which you have certain instruments which can be used, like you have wave staff, pressure recorder, accelerometer, buoy and shipbone wave recorder. Looking at the ecological survey, so the coastal zone has this particular problem of ecological sampling, and this problem is much more pertinent in the sublittoral zone. And but its main idea is that you should maximum use the secondary data and only go for primary data unless it is required. And you can also use like different scales of surveys, and then you can also have different kind of classification systems which can be used for this. And for this you should also refer to the ecological where we studied the methods for ecology part. So you may revisit that also. And one needs to be very clear on the timing of the field survey. You might also need to have repeat sampling because many ecosystems have high degree of seasonality. So you need to have repeat sampling. And you also need to have habitat survey. So you will undertake ecological survey of sublittoral and littoral habitat. You would undertake mapping of these areas, and you have various techniques which can be used, and it will depend on what kind of scale you are looking at. So most commonly suggested one is remote sensing and aerial imagery, and that all would require even ground truthing. That means you have to do the field investigation for that. So when you're dealing with a very smaller scale, you can rather than going for a very complex system, you can simply undertake walk over survey of the coastal area, and you can simply take pictures, photographs, and do the sampling. And you can use similar scales and classification systems. So it can be very simple as well. And for the purpose of survey of the maritime and benthic species and communities, you may refer to the ecology part, which we have already studied. So coming to the last part here, we see how you really evaluate the baseline conditions. So when you're evaluating the baseline conditions, you need to see that are there any sensitive geomorphological systems, and are there any high value species or habitats or sites in your particular area. So if you remember how we really take care of how do we evaluate the baseline conditions, what are the receptors, what are the sensitive receptors, what are the important receptors. So all that has to be taken care of, and you need to take care of all the protected areas and Ramsar sites which might be there. So you need to also look at the local notification, national notifications which are there. So you also need to look at the environmental management plan which might be prepared for this area. So even taking care of what kind of mitigation measures would be required here. So that also you should take in perspective. So that's all for this session. So summarizing what we really covered, we looked into the definitions and concepts, we looked at the range of definitions, then we covered what kind of information is needed for the coastal geomorphology, and like what are the various kinds of habitat, and then what you really undertake in the scoping, what the considerations you have to undertake when you are dealing with the coastal area, and then what kind of information, secondary data you need to collect when you're dealing with the baseline study in the coastal area, and then what kind of surveys have to be undertaken in this particular domain, and then how do you really evaluate the baseline condition. So this was the key reference for our particular session today, and then these are the suggested reading and watch for other typical terms which you looked at. So winding up, please feel free to ask questions. Let us know about any concerns you have. Do share your opinions, experiences, and suggestions. Looking forward to interacting and co-learning with you while exploring AIA. Thank you.